Chess is one of the oldest and most recognized games in the world. It is an exciting game of strategy and planning, which is why it is seen as a symbol of intelligence. However, chess is easy to learn and can be enjoyed by anyone at any level. Chess is played on an 8x8 board with 64 squares and 32 pieces, and the game is all about checkmating the king. Once the king is in checkmate, which we'll explain later, then the game is over. So to start, let's meet the king. Even though the king is the most important piece in chess, it isn't the most powerful. The king can only move one square at a time in any direction. Here are the squares where the white king can currently move. Here's one move. Now the king could move here. And here's another king move. In chess, both players have identical sets of pieces. You have a king, and so does your opponent. Each player will take turns making a move until the game is over. Now that you've learned how the king moves, it's your turn to practice moving the king. The king might be the most important piece in chess, but the queen is by far the most powerful. Like the king, the queen can move in any direction, forward, backward, to the sides, as well as diagonally. Unlike the king, the queen can move as far as she wants in any direction. The one thing the queen can't do is jump over other pieces. Let's look at some queen moves. In this position, the queen could go all the way up the diagonal. She could slide all the way across the board. She could now move all the way down here, or she could make some shorter moves, like here, here, and here's another queen move. Earlier, we mentioned that the queen cannot jump over other pieces. In this position, let's say the queen wants to get to this square. Notice that the king is currently in the way of the queen, so the queen would have to move to another square first, and only then, on the next turn, could the queen move here. Now that you've learned how the queen moves, it's your turn to practice moving the queen. After the queen, the rook is the second most powerful piece. It can move up, down, and to the sides as far as it wants, but the rook can only move in straight lines. Like the other pieces we've looked at so far, the rook also can't jump over any other piece. Let's take a look at some rook moves. In this position, the rook could move straight up, it could slide to the corner, it could move all the way down the board, now it could swing to the other side, or it could make some shorter moves, like here and here. Now that you've learned how the rook moves, it's your turn to practice moving the rook. The bishop is one of the most interesting pieces in chess because it can move as far as it wants, but only on diagonals. The bishop, just like the other pieces that we've met so far, cannot jump over other pieces. This means that the bishop has to stay on the same colored square it starts the game on for the entire game. In chess, you get two bishops. This bishop is called the light square bishop because it can only travel on the light squares. Meet the other bishop that you have in the game, the dark squared bishop. It moves exactly like the light squared bishop, but only on the dark square diagonals. Now that you've met both bishops, let's take a look at how they move. With just one move, the dark squared bishop can enter the longest dark square diagonal on the board. Let's do the same with the light squared bishop. Now, notice no matter how many bishop moves we make, the bishops never cross paths. They never block each other. And the reason why is because they're on opposite colored squares, so they never interfere with each other. They make a good team. Now that you've learned how the bishops move, it's your turn to practice moving the bishops. The knight is perhaps the most fun piece in chess. It is the only piece in chess that does not move in some sort of straight line. It moves in a strange L shape. The other interesting thing about the knight is it's the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces, like this. It takes a little practice to understand exactly how the knight moves. It goes 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square to the side, like this. Highlighted are all the possible squares the knight can move to on the next turn. Notice it always moves in the same pattern. 2 to the side and over 1, like this, or like this, up 2 and over 1, or down 2 and over 1. And notice that the knight moves from a light square to a dark square, and then on the next turn it moves from a dark square to a light square. The knight always switches colors with each turn it makes. Now that you've learned how the knight moves, it's your turn to practice moving this fun and tricky piece. The pawn sounds like it is the humblest of chess pieces, but it is really one of the most powerful. When working together, pawns are the soul of chess. Pawns have a few strange rules, so make sure to pay attention. Pawns can only move straight forward, and they can only move 1 square at a time. However, if it is their first move of the game, they can choose to move 2 squares forward if there is nobody blocking them, as pawns cannot jump over other pieces. Remember, the pawn can choose to advance 1 or 2 squares only on the first move. On all other moves, the pawn advances 1 square. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that cannot move backwards. One other thing that makes them strange is that while they can only move straight forward, pawns can only capture diagonally, and they can only capture 1 square away diagonally, even if it is their first turn. We will explain capturing in one of the next lessons. Let's see some pawn moves. In this position, since this pawn has yet to move in the game, white decides to move it 2 squares forward. Black, on the other hand, only advances this pawn 1 square. Remember, even though you can move your pawn 2 squares on its first move, you're not forced to do so. White now advances the pawn forward, and now both pawns are blocked and cannot move. In this position, how many white pawns can move? If you said 1, you're correct. Notice that this pawn is blocked by the black pawn directly in front of it. Remember, pawns cannot move backwards. White now has the option to move this pawn up 1 square. Notice this pawn cannot move 2 squares forward because the black pawn blocks it. Now it's your turn to practice using the pawns. Remember, your pawns are the only pieces that cannot move backwards, so what happens when they reach the other side of the board? They get a promotion. You must trade your pawn for another piece. It can be a knight, a bishop, a rook, or the powerful queen. It cannot stay a pawn, and it cannot become a king. Also, it does not have to be one of the pieces already captured in the game. Every pawn has the potential to be promoted into a queen. You could trade it for another queen and have two queens on the board, which is incredibly powerful. Now, let's practice promoting some pawns. Now that you know how the chess pieces move, it's time to set up the game. Before you put the pieces on, make sure you turn the chessboard so that there's a light square in the bottom right corner. You can remember this as white on the right. The easiest way to start placing the pieces is to place all of the pawns on the second rank for each side. In chess, rank is the word for row. Let's put all of the white pawns on one side of the board and all of the black pawns on the other side. Now let's put the rooks out in the corners. Let's follow that up by putting the knights next to the rooks. We'll soon learn that the knights are placed on the B and G files. In chess, file is the word for column. To continue, let's put the bishops next to the knights. And now we're left with the king and the queen. Does it matter where they go? Yes, it does. The queen always goes on the matching square. The white queen goes on the light square, and the black queen goes on the dark square. Notice they should be lined up together. Finally, put the kings on the last empty squares. Now you're ready to play. In chess, each side takes only one turn at a time, and by tradition, white always moves first. Now that the board is set up, it's your turn to practice making moves for both sides. In order to get better at chess, you will need to learn notation, which is often referred to as the language of chess. Every square on the chessboard has a name, which is actually just its coordinates. As we mentioned before, each column is called a file, and each row is called a rank. Every file in chess is given a letter, starting with the letter A on the left side of the board and going all the way to the letter H on the right. Every rank is given a number, starting with 1 on the white side of the board and going up to the number 8 on the black side of the board. Each square is named by its coordinate pair. Let's meet some of the squares. This square in the lower left-hand corner is known as A1. Notice we identify it with the letter first and the number second. Let's take a look and see where the E file meets with the fourth rank. Notice the arrows point at E4, so this square is known as E4. Let's draw a diagonal starting from A1 and go all the way up the board. Notice we land on the H8 square, and in between these squares we see B2, C3, D4, E5, F6, and G7. Together, this is known as the A1 to H8 diagonal, because the diagonal begins on A1 and ends on H8. Now that you've learned how to label each square on the chessboard, it's time to learn the notation of actual chess moves. Each piece has its own letter for chess notation. In this example, the king's letter is a capital K. With white to move, let's say the king is going to move to the E2 square. The way we describe that move is by saying the piece's letter first, which is capital K, then the square it moves to, E2. Remember, a piece always begins with a capital letter, and the square is always lowercase. So after the move, king E2, putting it all together, we say K, E2. Let's say black wants to play king to D7. In this case, it's the same idea. Capital K, lowercase D7. So piece, then square. K, D7. We will use the same idea for all the other pieces. The rook is a capital R, the queen, a capital Q, the bishop, a capital B. The knight, however, is a little bit different. Since the capital K is already used for the king, we use a capital N for the knight. For example, N E6. Finally, you may think that pawns are a capital P. In this case, pawns are only written as the square that they move to. For example, after the move E4, the notation is simply the square the pawn moved to, E4. Now that you've learned the language of chess, it's your turn to practice using chess notation. You've already learned how to move the pieces, and we've mentioned the idea of capturing. Let's talk more about capturing. In chess, when you capture a piece, you simply move your own piece to the same square as your opponent's piece and replace their piece with your own. The captured piece is then removed from the board. You don't stop before the captured piece, you replace it entirely. Let's watch this queen capture a pawn. Now let's watch this knight jump over one of its own pieces to capture the queen. Capturing pieces is a critical part of the game. However, you do not have to capture a piece if you don't want to. That being said, if you can capture more of your opponent's pieces than they capture of yours, it's going to be much easier to win. One question about capturing that we haven't answered is, how do you notate a capture? Let's say in this position that you plan on taking the black queen with your queen on b3. A good idea. You would write the piece that will capture it, in this case, the queen. So we use a capital Q. You then write an X, which means captures. And then you write the square where the piece gets captured. So after queen takes e6, we would write Q, X, e6. Here is one more capturing question. How do we notate a pawn capturing a rook and promoting to a queen at the same time? Does it sound complicated? Don't worry, it's just one extra step. We start by notating the capture. Remember, we mark a pawn with the file that it is currently on. In this case, the pawn is on the B file. So we would write a lowercase b, then we would write captures, which is an X, so lowercase b, X, and then the square that we capture, A8. So BX, A8. So far, we have BX, A8. Since we are promoting to a queen, you simply add to the end of your move an equal sign, and then write which piece you are promoting the pawn into, which is usually the queen. So putting it all together, we would write B takes A8 equals queen. Now it's your turn to practice capturing pieces. Check is the word that is used when one piece is threatening to capture the other side's king. Check basically means look out, king in danger. Let's take a look at some examples of playing check. In this position, can you see how white can threaten to capture the black king? That's right. Bishop to f6 check. White's bishop puts the black king in danger of capture, so black must deal with this check. In the next lesson, we will learn the 3 ways to get out of check. In this position, black's rook can put white's king into danger. After rook d1, the white king is in check, and white must respond to this attack. Finally, in this position, black's pawn is ready to capture the white knight. Remember, pawns capture one square away diagonally. Can you see how white can escape the pawn's attack and place the black king into check? If you found knight to g6, great job. The knight escapes danger and now puts the black king into check. One final question is, how do we notate a check? It is pretty easy. All you do is add a plus to the end of your typical move notation. This means after writing ng6, you add a plus at the end. So it'll look like this, ng6 plus, meaning that black is in check. Now it's your turn to practice playing check. As we learned in the last lesson, when the king is in check, it must get out of check. You cannot ignore check and play another move you want to play while leaving your king in check. You have to stop the check. Luckily, you have 3 easy ways to get out of check. The simplest way to get out of check is to move your king to a square where it is no longer in check, like this. Another way to get out of check is to block the check with one of your other pieces. Oftentimes, the best way to get out of check is by capturing the checking piece. Now let's see you escape check. If a king is in check, and it cannot escape check by moving, blocking, or capturing, then the king is said to be in checkmate. That means you win. Or maybe your opponent won. Again, checkmate is the entire goal of chess. It doesn't matter who has captured the most pieces, or how long it has taken, or anything else. If the king is in checkmate, it's game over. Once the king is in checkmate, you don't have to take the king off the board. It's time to shake hands and say, good game. Now it's your turn to checkmate. Chess can often be a long game with more than 100 moves played, but it can also be incredibly short if you want it to be. Many people want to know, what are the fastest checkmates? And we are going to show you, but keep in mind, none of these checkmates can be forced. These are only checkmates that you literally have to try to do on purpose because they can be otherwise defended very easily. Let's see the shortest possible checkmate on the board. White plays f3, not a great opening move, already exposing the king on the e1 to h4 diagonal. Black opens with e5. Notice the black queen is already looking at the weakened h4 square, ready to pay the white king a visit. White plays g4, further weakening the e1 to h4 diagonal, and the black queen pounces on the h4 square, delivering the fastest checkmate in chess. Notice that the white king cannot move, there's no way to block the check, and you can't capture the checking piece, so after 2 moves, the game is already over. In fact, it's time to start a new game. Let's see that idea again, but this time it will be white delivering the checkmate. After e4, black plays f6, d4, g5. Can you spot the checkmate? That's right, queen h5. The fastest checkmate for white is in 3 moves, and the fastest checkmate for black is in just 2 moves. Let's hope you never find yourself on the wrong side of this checkmate. Now it's your turn to practice the fastest checkmates. There is another kind of mate on the board called stalemate. Stalemate is what happens when your king is not in check, but you also have no other legal move on the board. And when this happens, it's a draw and nobody wins. You might be absolutely winning your game and about to checkmate the opponent's king, but if you fall into stalemate, it's a draw. This is best explained with some examples. In this position with white to move, the game would be a stalemate, because white's only piece, the king, does not have any legal squares to move to, and white is not in check. In this position, let's say white plays queen to c2. The queen gets 1 square closer to the king, but notice black's king is not in check and black does not have a legal move in this position. The position is a stalemate. Remember, in chess, you're never forced to make an illegal move, so black cannot put the king onto a square where it would be captured. In this position, can you find a better move for white? White can actually win the game in just 1 move after queen b2 checkmate. Remember, your opponent can never be in stalemate if they are in check. In this position, black looks doomed. The king is trapped in the corner. White is ready to deliver checkmate on the next move, and black is down lots of material. However, chess is a game of many opportunities, and even when things look really bad, you might have the chance to save the game, or at least draw. Notice that since black's king does not have any legal moves, if black's queen disappeared from the board, it would be a stalemate if it were black to move. In this position, can you find a way to make black's queen disappear and create a stalemate? If you found queen takes h2 check, great job. White must deal with the check, and the only way to get out of the check is to capture the black queen. Now the only remaining piece is the black king, and since black's king does not have any legal squares, and black is not in check, the game is a stalemate. What a save by black. Let's take a look at this position. If white played the move queen to c7, it's not a very wise move because white, first of all, could have won the game immediately with queen to b7 checkmate, but also queen to c7 traps black's king. But does that mean it's a stalemate? Not in this position, because notice black has another piece. Black could play the move h3, allowing white to correct the mistake from the last move and deliver checkmate with queen to b7. Notice if we added another pawn, just this pawn on h3, the position would now be a stalemate with black to move. Now that you've learned about stalemate, remember to stay alert and avoid it when you're winning, and when you're losing, keep your eyes open for the opportunity to save the game with stalemate. Stalemate is just one of the possible ways to end the game in a tie. Another way is to simply agree to a draw. This might happen if neither player can see a way to victory. One person offers the draw, and the other can accept or decline. Another way to get a draw is if the exact same position is repeated 3 times. After 3 repetitions, either player can claim a draw when it is their turn to move. Or, if you're playing online, a draw will automatically be called after 3 repetitions. Another way to draw is if neither player has enough pieces to checkmate, like lone king versus lone king. You'll learn more about this later. Finally, you can also draw if 50 pairs of moves have been played on the board without any captures or pawn moves. This keeps you from dying of boredom as you and your opponent move your rooks back and forth forever. Now it's your turn to practice drawn positions. One of the most unusual rules of chess is called castling. This move was invented to speed up the game and do 2 things at once. When you castle, your king moves toward the safety of the corner and your rook comes toward the action in the middle. You literally are moving 2 pieces at once, but it counts as just 1 move. You can castle in either direction, left or right. In either case, your king moves over only 2 squares, and then the rook from that side is moved directly to the other side of the king. Like this. And here's another example of castling. Let's say you're playing a game right here on chess.com. Here are 2 ways you can make the castling move. The first option is to drag the king to the square where it will castle, and then the rook will automatically move. Like this. Another option is to click the square the king is currently on, in this case e8, and then the square where you will move the king, g8. So we click e8, followed by g8, and now we're castled. Castling is a great move with many benefits if it is used at the right time. However, there are a few conditions that may prevent you from castling. First off, you cannot castle when you are in check. You must first deal with the check before trying to castle. Secondly, you cannot castle if your king would castle through a check, or after castling, your king would land into a check. Next, you cannot castle if there are any pieces in between your king and your rook. It must be completely empty. In this position, both white and black have to move 1 piece before they're able to castle. After knight f3 and bishop c5, for example, both sides are now able to castle kingside. Finally, you cannot castle if your king has made any other move before, or if the rook you are castling with has already moved. It must be the first move for both pieces. In this position, the only legal castling move is for black. Since white's king is already moved, white cannot castle. Notice black can only castle with the rook on h8 because the other rook has already moved. What is the notation for castling? It depends on if you castle kingside or queenside. In this position, let's say white castles kingside. The way you would write it is 0-0. If black now castles queenside, we would add 1 more 0. So it would be 0-0-0. One way that can help you remember this is notice on the king side there are 2 squares between the white king and the rook. Notice 0-0 has 2 zeros. So kingside castling, 2 squares, 2 zeros. Notice on the queen side there's 3 squares between the king and the rook. Queenside castling has 3 zeros, 0, dash, 0, dash, 0. Now that you've learned this powerful move, it's time to practice castling. The last weird rule in chess is called en passant, which is French for in passing. This rule was introduced at the same time pawns were allowed to move 2 squares on their first move. When that happened, sometimes pawns would move past other pawns without giving the other pawn an opportunity to capture, which didn't seem fair. So en passant was invented. Pay attention, it's tricky. If your opponent's pawn moves forward 2 squares, which it can only do if it is that pawn's first move, and it lands directly next to one of your pawns, then on your next turn, and that turn only, you have the opportunity to capture that pawn as if it had only moved 1 square, like this. Let's take a look at that again. If a pawn is moved forward 2 squares and lands next to another pawn, that pawn can capture the first pawn on its very next move. You move behind the pawn as if it had moved only 1 square and capture it, placing it off the board. You might get some weird looks if you do this move in a game with someone who doesn't know, but it's an important rule of chess. Now that you've learned en passant, let's have you try it. Now that you've learned how to move, to capture, to check, and checkmate, as well as do the special moves in chess like castling and en passant, it's time for you to feel what it's like in a real game. In a real game, nobody is there to tell you what to move. You have to think and decide, what is the right move? Should I move a piece? Or can I capture something? Should I castle? Or try to promote one of my pawns? This is where the thinking part of chess comes in, and you have to try and decide what your best move is. The only way to do this is by looking at the board and considering both your options and your opponent's possible plans, and then trying to decide which move improves your position the most. Sometimes the right move will jump right out at you. Rook h8, checkmate. At other times, you'll have absolutely no idea what the best move is. Let's see if you can find a good move in each of the following positions. Black is currently up 3 pawns, so Black decides to offer a trade of queens, thinking it will be easier to win the game without having to deal with White's queen. Black didn't consider what the queen was doing on the 8th rank. Can you find White's best move? The Black queen gave up protection of the back rank and forgot to ask what checks White has in the position. White only has 1 check, but it's checkmate. If you found Queen e8 checkmate, Great job! This checkmate is known as a back rank checkmate. In this position, after Rook A1 check, it looks like Black is about to deliver a back rank checkmate. What is White to do? Well, if White decides to block with Rook E1, notice that doesn't help because after Rook takes E1, it's checkmate. Let's look a little closer. Can you find another white piece that can help us deal with the check? If you found the move Bishop takes A1, great job! The bishop moves all the way from the other side of the board to come to the rescue, capturing the checking piece. Remember, if you can capture a checking piece, this can often be the best way to get out of check. In this position, what do you think is White's best move? If you're thinking Rook A8 delivering a back rank checkmate, you have to remember, it's not just your moves you have to consider, we also have to figure out what is our opponent doing. In this position, White's best move is also White's only move, because notice, White is in check. And in this position, White must deal with the check first and play King H1. Now Black has to be careful and deal with White's threat on the next turn. In this position, can you find White's best move? Notice that we can capture a pawn with Rook takes E4, but then Black is able to do the same thing with Knight takes A7. Remember, when you find a good move, always look for a better move. Don't forget about your pawn on A7. It's one move away from reaching the 8th rank. Do you remember what happens when a pawn reaches the other side of the board? That's right, the pawn gets a promotion. Notice the newly promoted queen puts the black king into check and threatens the knight all at the same time. After king f7, queen takes c6 wins the knight. It takes time and practice to find the best move. Now it's your turn to continue practicing finding the best move. You know the rules and how to play, but now it's time to see the ideas you have learned put into action in an actual game. In this game, we'll see how two pieces working together can be a powerful force, and that a king surrounded by pieces isn't always safe. Let's take a look. White begins the game with e4, controlling the center and opening up lines for the queen and light-squared bishop. Black plays c6, a move we haven't seen yet. The idea is to prepare the move d5 on the next turn and attack the strong pawn on e4. White plays d4, controlling more space in the center and also opening up the dark-squared bishop. Black strikes back in the center with d5, threatening to capture the pawn on e4 on the very next move. When the opponent threatens to take one of our pieces, it's natural to feel worried. Remember, it's okay to make even trades, such as a pawn for a pawn. What you don't want is to give away your pieces for nothing. In this situation, White could push the pawn forward with e5, White could capture the pawn on d5, or, as in the game, protect the pawn and develop a piece with knight to c3. After d takes e4, knight takes e4, White's knight recaptures the pawn and moves directly into the center. Black now plays knight to d7, developing a knight and also preparing the next move, knight g to f6, with the idea that if the knight gets captured, Black is ready to recapture the knight, like that. The drawback to this move is the light-squared bishop is blocked, and also notice Black's king has no moves. We'll take a look and see if that becomes a problem. White plays bishop to c4, activating the bishop to a powerful diagonal, and as you know, pointing at the weakest point in Black's camp, f7. Black plays knight g to f6, attacking white's knight, and white plays knight to g5, avoiding the knight's attack and joining the light-squared bishop in attacking the f7 square. In this position, black should play e6, blocking the light-squared bishop's path to the f7 square, but black does not have a sense of danger in the position and plays h6, attacking the knight and assuming that it's going to move backwards. Can you find the move that immediately wins the game for white? That's right, bishop takes f7. White delivers checkmate, threatening to capture the king on the next turn, and notice black's king is surrounded, or should we say smothered, by its own pieces. It cannot escape the attack. You've learned a lot so far. Can you put your ideas into action? Let's prove it in the challenges. Control the center, and you can control the game. We may have heard that it's important to control the center and develop our pieces as close to the center as possible, but what exactly does this mean? The center squares are e4, d4, d5, and e5. A popular, as well as strong opening move for white is to play e4. White moves a pawn directly in the center, controlling the d5 and f5 squares in black's territory, and it also opens up lines for white's light-squared bishop and queen to quickly enter the game. A good response for black is to play the same move, e5. By controlling the center, both sides prevent enemy pawns from entering their territory. If white tries to force two pawns in the center with d4, threatening black's pawn on e5, it's important for black to break up white's pawn center with e takes d4. When white's dreams of taking over the center with pawns have been shattered, so black should not have any serious problems in the opening. Is the center really that important to control? What happens if black wants to move pawns on the edge of the board, such as a6? Pawn moves are important when they can control key squares, especially in the center, and when they open up lines for pieces to enter the game. This move does not control an important central square, and it only allows the rook to move to a7, not exactly improving black's position. Since black does not want to control the important center, don't be shy. Let's take the center for ourselves with d4. White's pawn duo control key squares in black's camp, c5, d5, e5, and f5, making it difficult for black to activate pieces on these squares. If black continues to make meaningless pawn moves such as h6, black has no central control, and besides the pawns, only 4 pieces can move: the knights, which were already able to move at the start of the game, and each rook only has 1 square. Not a good start to the game for black. White's pieces, on the other hand, enjoy great freedom. White's queen and 2 bishops enjoy open lines, and white's knights are ready to jump into the game with a move like knight f3. What happens if black wakes up from a deep sleep and decides to start developing pieces toward the center with knight to c6? Pieces need pawns in the center so they are not constantly attacked. Since black does not have a pawn on d5, white can simply march forward with d5, grabbing space and attacking black's knight, forcing it to waste time by moving again. Black should admit the mistake and retreat the knight, but instead decides to move the knight to the edge of the board with knight a5. Most pieces do not like being on the edge of the board, and the knight is especially weak as it only controls 4 squares. Compare this to white's knight on f3. It controls 8 total squares, twice as many squares as black's knight on a5 controls. More importantly, black's knight doesn't have any safe squares, so white can attack this poorly placed piece with b4. If black does nothing, white will simply win a piece. So after knight c4, black's knight has already moved 3 times, and white can now develop a piece and win the knight with bishop takes c4. Black is in serious trouble, but should at least try to prevent white's central pawns from advancing with d6. Instead, black plays knight f6. Knights love to be close to the center of the board, but you have to prevent enemy pawns from attacking them. Since black has not controlled the center with pawns, how can white gain space and attack black's knight? That's right, once again by advancing a center pawn with e5. Black should once again retreat the knight, admitting another mistake, but decides to lunge forward with knight g4. Notice most of black's escape squares are controlled by pawns. Even black's pawn on h6 prevents a potential knight retreat. How can white win more material? If you found h3, nice work. If black takes the e5 pawn, white simply captures it with the knight on f3. If black plays knight takes f2, at least grabbing a pawn before losing the knight, white should not be afraid to move the king. Let's win material with king takes f2. By controlling the center with pawns and actively developing pieces toward the center, white took advantage of black's careless play and is simply up 2 pieces with an excellent position. Now it's time to practice taking over the center in the challenges. As you continue your chess journey, the starting position in front of us is going to be very familiar to you. But how often do you think about the board without any pieces? When you take a look at a blank chessboard, what comes to mind for you? Do you consider it a canvas with unlimited potential, the beauty just waiting to be discovered? Or perhaps you see 64 squares, 32 light and 32 dark. It's very important to become familiar with the chessboard. Specifically, the chessboard looks flat, and all the squares appear the same, but not all squares are created equally. Consider the center squares e4, d4, d5, and e5. These squares are the chess mountain, the highest point on the chessboard. You want to make sure you have your fair share of the chess mountain, or inner center, and the best way to do that is planting flags, or pawns, in the center of the board. You're claiming e4 as your territory on the mountain. Black will often play e5, doing the same thing. The squares surrounding the chess mountain, or inner center, is what we call the outer center. You can consider the outer center as the chess hill, not as high as the chess mountain, but still elevated above all the other squares. When we think about developing our pieces, think about the chess mountain and hill, or inner center and outer center. We want to develop our forces to help control these critical squares. Now that we have a general idea of where we want to place our pieces, let's return White's pieces to the starting squares. Let's pretend for a moment that we can only move 2 pawns and the rest of our pieces only once. Where would you develop your forces? Thinking about the chess mountain, or inner center, we don't have to hesitate to play e4 and d4. Knights love to jump into the outer center and help control the key central squares with knight f3 and knight c3. Bishops love open diagonals, so bishop c4 and bishop f4 are natural squares for these pieces. Take a look at all of the squares these bishops control in enemy territory. Castling has a very important role in our development. For this exercise, let's consider castling as the king move. White's king wisely evacuates the center and now has 3 loyal pawns protecting it. Castling also allows us to bring our rook into the action, especially helping control the center, with a move like rook e1. Now we only have our queen and rook on a1 to move. White's queen can be well placed on e2 or d2. Let's move the queen to d2. Now White's rooks are connected, and White's queen backs up the dark squared bishop, supercharging that diagonal. Finally, we would complete our development with rook a to d1. Notice our 2 central pawns, knights, and bishops are all in the inner and outer center. White's major pieces, the queen and 2 rooks, help support the center, so in the future, White can start advancing pawns up the board. Of course, this is only a dream scenario, and our opponent certainly has something to say about this. So what does a position look like when both sides are following this strategy, activating their pieces and controlling these key squares? Let's take a look. This is a very typical opening position, and notice the balance of the forces. Both sides have pawns in the inner center, controlling their fair share of space. Both sides have castled their king to safety, and the knights and bishops are all controlling key squares in the center. With all this in mind, let's have some fun and see development in action. How important is it to develop our pieces to safe, active squares where they work together in harmony? When one side follows this advice and the other side ignores it, we'll soon find an answer. After e4, e5, knight f3, White combines development with attack. Black's most popular and flexible move is knight c6, developing a piece toward the center and protecting the e5 pawn. Instead, Black plays d6. Is this a good move for Black? It depends on which bishop you ask. Black's light-squared bishop enjoys a newly opened diagonal, but Black's dark-squared bishop isn't exactly thrilled that it's blocked by its own pawn on d6 and cannot enter the action in the center. Although this move isn't bad, Black's dark-squared bishop will have to accept a more passive role than we would prefer. White's bishop on the king side has no such worries after bishop c4, where it controls key central squares and is pointing directly at Black's weak f7 pawn. Black decides to develop the knight on b8. What is the best square for this piece? If Black plays knight a6, when a knight moves to the edge of the board, a famous saying is, a knight on the rim is dim. Black's knight only controls 4 squares, and none of them are squares in the inner center. Let's compare the last move with knight c6. Developing the knight toward the center with knight c6 is the best square for this piece. It controls both e5 and d4, key central squares, and controls a total of 8 squares, twice as many as it controlled on the edge of the board. Black selected a third option and played knight d7. The knight only protects the e5 square in the center, so it's less active, and now Black's light-squared bishop cannot move. White continues to demonstrate positive development with knight c3. And once again, Black makes a passive knight move with knight e7. Instead of working together, Black's pieces are standing in each other's way. Notice that both of Black's bishops cannot move, which means the knights would have to move again in order to free the natural diagonals for the bishops, wasting more time. Time is not on Black's side, and White punishes Black's poor development immediately with knight g5. Notice how White's pieces are working together. The knight on g5 joins the light-squared bishop in attacking the weak f7 pawn. White's knight on c3 and pawn on e4 join the light-squared bishop in protecting the key d5 square, which means if Black plays the best move in a bad position, d5, White can simply capture the pawn and win material. Instead of blocking this dangerous diagonal with d5, black decides to play f6, turning the position from bad to completely losing. What would you play as white? You may notice that the queen on d8 is trapped, so you could actually win this piece with knight e6 or knight f7. But is there an even stronger move to play? If you found bishop f7, checkmate, great job. The king cannot capture the bishop as it's protected by the knight on g5. Black's pieces smother its own king, so it's game over. Now that you've learned the importance of developing your pieces rapidly toward key central squares and using your pieces to work together as a team, you're ready to show off your skills in the challenges. Castle early? Castle early and castle often. It's a funny, but also helpful phrase to remember during your games. After 3 moves, white is a pawn in the center and developed a knight and bishop toward the center. What's next? It's never too early to make sure your king is safe, so a great move for white is to castle. Remember, this is the one time you can move 2 pieces at once. You move your king 2 squares, and then the rook moves next to your king, like this. Think of castling as building a house for your king. The king finds shelter behind 3 loyal pawns. So it isn't easy for your opponent to tear down your defenses. The other great thing about castling is it answers a question you might be wondering. How do I bring my rooks into the game? Castling allows your rook to move toward the center, where it can enter the action. If you are black in this position, what would your plan be? Castle early and castle often. How can black prepare castling? That's right. Let's move our knight into the action and control the center with knight f6, preparing to castle and threatening white's pawn on e4. After white protects the e4 pawn with a move such as d3, the house has been built for black's king. Let's move it in with castling. Both sides have safe kings thanks to castling, and each of the rooks used for castling are excited to enter the game in the center. Is castling really that important? Since our opening strategy should be to control the center, actively develop our pieces to help support the center, and castle our king to safety, we definitely do not want our king to sit in the center of the board where most of the action usually takes place. In this position, white is castled, but black's king is sitting on a central file which is wide open. With white to move, we can see our rook enter the action with rook e1 check. Rooks love open files, especially files leading to the enemy king. Notice black's king cannot escape the center, as white's bishop controls its escape square. Black could block the check with the bishop, but white would simply capture that bishop, and once again black's king would be in check. Black's only other move is queen e7, blocking the check, but now black's queen is in danger. Since white has two attackers, the bishop and rook, and black only has one defender of the queen, the king, white can play rook takes e7 check, winning black's queen and checking black's king. Notice black's king cannot capture the rook, as then black's king would be in check. Black would love to castle the king to safety, but since you can't castle out of check, black has to settle for a move such as king d8. Notice black's rooks are not connected, so they cannot work together, and black is down an entire queen. Now that we learned how much rooks love castling as they can enter the action in the center, would you believe white has an even stronger way to take advantage of black's exposed king? Instead of winning the queen with the awesome rook check, we can actually checkmate black's king in the center of the board. How is this possible? Our path to victory begins with delivering a check with our most powerful piece, queen to e2 check. Once again, black's king cannot move as white's bishop prevents its escape, so after queen e7, using our queen as an attacker with the bishop as a helper, we can play queen takes e7, checkmate, capturing black's queen, attacking the king, and covering all of the escape squares. The bishop is the helper piece because it protects white's queen, meaning that black cannot capture the queen, so the game is over. Let's look at one last example together. Sometimes we do our best to castle early, and it just doesn't work out as planned. Don't worry, it happens to all of us. The most important thing is not to dwell on the past, but focus on what you can do now and build a better future. White is down a pawn, and black is threatening to capture our rook on h1. To make matters worse, our king is still in the center, and black's rook that was used for castling is lined up with our king. Not a good sign. What is white to do? How can we move our king to safety and protect our rook on h1 at the same time? That's right, we can castle queenside. Our king has escaped the dangers of the center, and now the rooks are connected, protecting each other on the first rank. White's position isn't perfect, but it's a lot better now that we've castled. You've done a great job exploring the importance of protecting our king by castling. Now let's castle early and often in the challenges.